Well, welcome, gentlemen. I'm looking forward to a great conversation about privacy. Lee, I'm going to start with you. You're on top of what people think about that. That's what you measure all the time. Where are people now in their thinking about privacy online?
It's been so interesting in the midst of the pandemic outbreak to watch how privacy issues have come even into more sharp relief as Americans are contemplating things like contact tracing. They're divided about the virtue of it. They're divided about whether it will help them. And they're not at all excited about the prospect of location apps, for instance, being used to enforce social distancing. So those are very typical American answers, which speaks to the sort of larger issues that we've always seen and have intensified in recent years related to privacy. People are concerned about the ecosystem of data gathering. They're confused about what's being gathered and how it's being used in ways potentially against them. They feel like they don't have any control over how the data are used. And when you ask them, are you getting benefits out of this? About a quarter can identify at least something, but a lot of people, particularly when you weigh the benefits and risks, they will say that the risks far outweigh the benefits. So it's been an escalating sense that privacy issues matter a lot, and particularly in fraught circumstances like the current ones.
Sounds to me what you're saying, and I don't want to mischaracterize it, you tell me, is the COVID crisis has, just deepened people's confusion rather than moving them from one direction to the other. Is that right?
Yeah, that's a great read on it. The one thing that might have changed is that pre-COVID, when we were asking people about risks and benefits and what they were willing to share, their default setting was wariness and not being happy with the proposition. In the COVID situation, the trade-off of sharing information potentially for some public health good is a little bit more sharp in their heads. And so they're pondering that more deeply than they would have been thinking about issues about trade-offs in the pre-COVID era.
So Andrew, given that people aren't delighted with what's happening, where are we in terms of regulation? We're constantly hearing about, well, we need new rules about privacy on the internet. There's been legislation talk endlessly, it seems, and promises that something's going to happen. Where are we now?
It's a good question. One of the problems with a lot of the regulatory responses that we see is that they're not really attempts to improve privacy or security or any of those things on the internet, but rather attempts to bring other kinds of approaches to media, essentially broadcast type approaches to the internet. And so they don't use the strengths of the internet in order to increase the privacy of individuals. And I think that that's one of the areas where we have the biggest challenge, is to try to undertake regulation and undertake action on the internet in favor of privacy in a way that is consistent with the way the internet itself is designed.
How does that work? What are the strengths of the internet when it comes to privacy? All we hear about is the opposite, how it was developed in a way to be so open that you couldn't impose privacy on it.
So it's true that it's very hard to impose privacy sort of from the outside or on the whole thing. One of the important things to understand about the internet is it's designed as a distributed system. It's a radically distributed system. And because of that radical distribution, what you have are the ability for individuals to ensure high degrees of privacy in their interactions, but only if they have the tools to do it. And what we're seeing are sort of two parallel things. One, we see governments attempting to impose privacy in a sort of top-down way selectively. So it's private for various kinds of people, but not private in other cases. The typical trade-off here is privacy versus security that people try to make. And in those cases, what we see is that there's this attempt to control in the interaction really from one side, rather than giving the individuals the tools to enforce their own privacy preferences. And I think what we need to do instead is figure out how to make people more capable of ensuring their own privacy online, rather than attempting to legislate it across the board for all of the internet.
Well, we have our own way to install privacy. This little thing comes up on our screen and says, hey, is it okay to use the cookies? And then, so we have a choice, right? Lee,
Well, I think that I wish that were the case. That's actually a great example of something that was intended, I think, to do the right thing. Generally speaking, that came from the general data protection rules in Europe. And what we see there is that it was a good attempt, because the idea was to put the onus on the people who wanted to collect the data. But what it's really come to in implementation is this sort of bureaucratic thing in which you have to check, oh, did you do this thing? Did you do that thing? And so you get these sort of cookie checkboxes that, everybody has to acknowledge the cookies. And it's just a waste of time, because all that really happens is you have to say, oh, yes, I agree to this, or you can't use the website. And, that is not really the kind of choice that enables people to make, reasonable decisions.
Lee, what does the data say about what can be done? What are people unhappy with? And does any of the proposed regulatory approaches have anything to do with what people actually think and what they're worried about?
Yeah, Andy's point is exactly right and reflected in the public opinion data. People want control over their information. They're perfectly willing in many cases to make a bargain. I'll share some stuff about me with you in return for something of value from you, but it's very contingent, very conditional. Different kinds of information have different weights with people, and so they think about it differently. So the frustrating thing for policymakers, and even the people who are trying to implement privacy systems, is there aren't clear, bright lines. It's case by case, and the COVID moment is a perfect example of that. Pre-COVID, people would not have been thinking necessarily about sharing their data for public health good purposes. Now they're pondering that, and if you can imagine contact tracing regimes that are clear about that, are trying very seriously to keep data anonymized and keep data protected. You could see Americans being willing to make that bargain, but they're not convinced now that either governments are trustworthy enough to do that, or that companies are trustworthy enough to do that.
Now, speaking of those companies, do they really want change? They say that, we're willing we know we need regulation, and we welcome regulation. Do they really? Do they want significant change? What have each of you found?
Stephen, you wrote the book on this. I'd be interested in what you found, and let's just bring you into this conversation.
Well, I'll give Andrew a shot, then I'll talk about it. Go ahead.
Oh, well, I mean, a lot of this sort of depends on the position that the company has in the market, right? If you're an overwhelming winner right now, this is a great time for regulation to come into place, because it sort of cements the position that people have. And very frequently, regulatory regimes are extraordinarily good at maintaining whatever the status quo is when the regulation takes effect. So I can imagine that there are people who are very, very strong in favor of new regulation, new regulatory approaches that ensure their position puts in place. And we see this actually in some of the infrastructure plays that are going on in terms of anti-terrorism and so on, where essentially the idea is to build filters that some company has built permanently into the infrastructure itself.
Right. Well, my own view, and Lee's right. I've written books about, most recently, Facebook, and I wrote a book about Google. And recently talked to the CEO of Google, and we touched on this. I feel that they do want regulation that ultimately, and maybe this isn't their only motivation, but is going to wind up making them even more winners in the competitive battle in the marketplace. Where they don't want to go is to present viewers with a choice that Lee talked about earlier. It really comes to this. They say that the trade-off from sharing information with them is that you get a better experience, you get better ads shown to you. But there's other trade-offs that, both in cases, there's information that's stored about you that you don't necessarily want. Sometimes the aggregate of information tells more about you than what you want. I was really struck when I was writing my book about Facebook to talk to the researcher who found that there's as few as 10 likes people could know your political orientation, your sexual orientation. And at the time he wrote that paper, that was public information. Anyone can go to Facebook and get enough information about you to learn things that you might not wanted to share, that you did it, inadvertently. And with 300 likes, he said, Facebook knows more about you than your spouse knows. And that information could be used not just to serve you stuff that you want to see, but it could be serving you stuff that you could be manipulated with. I feel that they're a little cute when they say they want regulation. Our time's getting short, so let me ask each of you how optimistic you are that either with COVID or anything else, that the situation is going to be changed. If we have this conversation in a year, would we be in a better place? Lee, what do you think?
I think we're going through a massive natural experiment about trust and when people will feel comfortable sharing their information. You would hope certainly after a year of doing this in multiple jurisdictions, we will know a lot more about how to convince people that their data can be used for public good, but do it in a way that doesn't jeopardize what they worry about.
Okay, Andrew, very quickly.
If you asked me at any time in the past what was going to happen on the internet, even in 18 months, I think I would have just thrown up my hands and been wrong. So I'm not sure that I'm prepared to make a blanket statement today.
Okay, all right. Well, there we go. No one knows. So, but we could hope. Thanks to both of you, and everyone stay safe.